Morning. Welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I am Robert Sumwalt, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. Joining us today, my colleagues, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Jennifer Homendy. Today, we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the inadvertent activation of the fuel shutoff lever and the subsequent ditching on the East River of an Airbus AS350 B-2 helicopter in New York City on March the 11th, 2018. This was a doors-off flight operated by Liberty Helicopters Incorporated under contract with Nyon Air. The ditching was survivable, but the helicopter's floats only partially and unevenly deployed. After the helicopter touched down upright on the water, it rolled over to the right and within 11 seconds became completely inverted. The pilot survived with minor injuries. Tragically, all 5 passengers on board the helicopter drowned. On behalf of all of us here at the NTSB, we'd like to offer our sincere condolences to the families and friends of those who have been lost in this tragic, tragic event. Our entire purpose for being here is to learn from tragic events like this so that others don't go through it, so that we can prevent these things in the future. American aviation has a good safety record, in some respects amazingly good. That comes from being relentlessly safety conscious and from putting safety at the center of every decision. As this investigation has revealed, safety was far from central at Liberty and Nyon Air. It was not only that Liberty and Nyon Air were not vigilant, although this too was true. Rather, they went beyond the lack of vigilance. They intentionally exploited a regulatory loophole to the detriment of their customers' safety. Specifically, if a business defines its operation as aerial work or aerial photography, it can operate under the less stringent requirements and more modest oversight of Part 91 General Aviation Rules. By contrast, if a business conducts air tours under either the Air Tours Part 91 rules or Part 135, the requirements are more stringent and there's more FAA oversight. By the intent of these regulations, it would have been a Part 91 air tour flight operating with a letter of authorization. But as we will discuss, it was operated under general aviation rules, making use of the aerial work and aerial photography exception. Liberty and Nyon Air were aware that they were operating within this loophole. Nyon Air Customer Experience Training Manual advised their personnel to avoid using words such as tour, route, and sightseeing, and to use the words custom, photo flight, and photography. Employees were to listen for indications, and I quote, FAA, anyone with a badge. Lacking appropriate guidance documents, FAA inspectors appeared to believe that they could not push back on Part 91 general aviation status of the flights or inspect them. Glaring safety deficiencies were present and cloaked in the exception were not caught. In addition to the helicopter-installed FAA-Approved Restraints, each passenger wore a restraint that was connected to the helicopter by a tether in order to prevent falls during open-door flight. But the harness tether system also impeded egress. So, Nyon Air equipped the harness with cutting tools so passengers could cut the tether in case of an emergency. Let's think about that. In an emergency, in such a situation where the helicopter was on fire or in danger of sinking, the plan was for passengers to cut their tethers, which was attached to the backs of their harnesses. Something is terribly wrong with this plan. But the FAA Principal Operations Inspector assigned to Liberty said that because Liberty's Fly Nyon branded flights were Part 91, he did not feel compelled to observe for himself the operation of the harness tether system, and he did not do so. But there are many more facets to this accident, as we will discuss this morning. But one question brings all these facets together. And we will bear this question in mind in relation to each decision point that led to the accident. What would be safer? This question applies to rules for passenger behavior. It applies to the use of the supplemental restraints. It applies to the aerial work and the aerial photography exception. It applies to the helicopter's floats. What would be safer? Now, what would be less not what would be less burdensome to the company, not what would be the most fun or thrilling helicopter experience? What would be safer? A safety management system is an organized business process that maintains this question front and center throughout an organization. It can be the backbone of an effective safety culture. When businesses and regulators stop asking that question, the question of what would be safer, this board sees the tragic results. And today we will work to prevent accidents like this from happening again. In today's board meeting, the staff will present the pertinent facts and analysis that are found in the draft report. They will present draft findings, draft probable cause, and draft recommendations to the board, and then we on the board will ask questions and deliberate to ensure that the report that we adopt today truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. The public docket for this report contains over 2,000 pages of additional information, including factual reports of the investigation, a transcript of the onboard image recording, interview summaries, and other relevant material. And that's available at our webpage at www.ntsb.gov. Once finalized, the accident report will also be available on the same website. Now, Managing Director Sharon Bryson, if you'll please introduce the staff. Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good morning to the board members. A few announcements. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for those that have not already done so, if you could please silence your mobile phones and other electronic devices. In addition, there are 2 exits from the boardroom here at the front of the auditorium on either side of the dais. If you go down the stairway just underneath the exit sign and through the door, it'll take you into the hallways of the lower level of this office building before you depart the facility. The other exit is the way that you entered the boardroom. Please walk back up the aisle, proceed out the glass doors where you entered, up the stairs, and exit through the large glass doors to the outside. Once you've exited, turn left and follow the sidewalk to the end of the street. NTSB staff and security personnel will direct you in the event of an emergency, and we will also direct you when it's safe to return to the boardroom. In addition, there is also an AED device in the lobby of the boardroom if anyone should need that. Security personnel can contact 911 also if needed. If you have any questions or concerns, your safety here while you're here in this meeting is of utmost importance to us, so please don't hesitate to talk to one of the staff members of the NTSB. Seated at the panel this morning, unless otherwise noted, are staff members of the Office of Aviation Safety. On the first row, starting to my right, is Dana Schultz, the Director of the Office of Aviation Safety. To her right is Todd Gunther, the investigator in charge for this accident. To his right is Chihoon Shin, who we know here at the board as Cheech, who is doing airworthiness for us. Emily Gibson is to Cheech's right. She is handling survival factors. And at the end of the table is Dr. William Bramble, who is handling safety management organizational. Directly behind me is Darlene Hatchett from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications, and she is the director of that office. To her right is Kathy Silba, our general counsel. To Kathy's right is Jim Ritter, who's the director of our Office of Research and Engineering. To Jim's right is Kathy Gagne, the report writer for this investigation. To Kathy's right is Captain David Lawrence, who's handling operational factors. To his right is Captain Van McKinney, also handling operational factors. In the very back, behind Darlene, is Don Ike, a meteorologist, who is also going to help us with visuals and the timer for the proceeding. To Don's right is Harry Reichel, power plants. To his right is Marie Moeller, aircraft performance from the Office of Research and Engineering. Sean Payne, who is also from the Office of Research and Engineering, who is handling onboard image recorders. To Sean's right is Dr. Mary Pat McKay from Research and Engineering, one of our medical officers. And to Mary Pat's right is Nathan Hoyt from our Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. The presentations will begin with the investigator in charge, Todd Gunther.
Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt and members of the board. Today we will discuss an accident involving a Liberty Helicopter's AS350 B2 that occurred on March 11, 2018 near New York City. The Fly Nyan branded flight was operated by Liberty Helicopters per a contractual agreement with Nyan Air. The company advertised the flight as a 14 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Part 91 aerial photography flight. About 16 minutes into the flight, the engine lost power, and the pilot performed an auto-rotative descent and ditching on the East River in New York. During the accident, the 5 passengers drowned, the pilot sustained minor injuries, and the helicopter was substantially damaged. An animation of the accident flight was created to highlight the issues surrounding the flight of the helicopter from just before takeoff until the accident occurs. The animation also contains videos of the accident that were captured by witnesses located near the accident site. The videos are shown at the end of the 5-minute animation. For those of you in the boardroom, if you do not wish to listen to or view the animation and videos, you may exit the boardroom, and those watching by webcast may wish to turn down the volume and turn away from their display. Please play the animation. On March 11, 2018, about 19:08 Eastern Daylight Time, an Airbus Helicopters AS350 B2, operated by Liberty Helicopters per contractual agreement with Nyan Air, lost engine power during a doors-off flight over New York City. The pilot performed an auto-rotative descent and ditching on the East River, and the helicopter rolled inverted. Both Liberty and Nyan Air considered the flight to be an aerial photography flight. Before departure for the flight, each passenger was restrained by a full-body fall protection harness in addition to the helicopter's installed FAA-Approved Restraints. The harness was connected to the helicopter by a tether. The harness tether system was intended to keep the passengers from falling out of the helicopter when taking photographs while extending their feet outside the helicopter's open doorways. About 1850, the accident helicopter departed Hilo Kearny Heliport, Kearny, New Jersey, with the pilot and 5 passengers on board for the intended 30-minute local flight. The flight traveled toward the Statue of Liberty at altitudes between 300 and 500 feet above ground level, then flew near the statue and other landmarks before proceeding north up the East River. The pilot radioed the air traffic control tower at LaGuardia Airport and requested a route up the East River to the north end of Central Park. The air traffic controller provided a clearance to proceed with instructions for the flight to remain at or below an altitude of 2,000 feet above mean sea level. Radar data showed that the helicopter then proceeded along the East River and climbed to an altitude of 1,900 feet above mean sea level. The pilot was seated on the right, 1 passenger was in the left front seat, and 4 passengers were in the back seats.
3 floor-mounted engine control levers were located between the 2 front seats. 2 of these controls were the fuel flow control lever and the fuel shutoff lever. As the flight proceeded, the front passenger rotated outboard in his seat, extended his feet outside the helicopter, and leaned back several times to take photographs. Onboard video indicated that each time that the front passenger leaned back, the tail from the tether attached to the back of his harness hung down in the vicinity of the helicopter's floor-mounted engine controls. At 19:05:51, the front seat passenger resumed a more upright seated position, and the tail of his tether appeared to be taut and extended toward the area of the helicopter's floor-mounted controls. The front seat passenger then pulled on the door frame hand grip to adjust his seating position. His tether tail remained taut, but appeared to pop upward as a unit. The onboard video recording captured a reduction in ambient engine sounds about 2 seconds later. The helicopter then began to lose altitude. The pilot said he heard the low rotor RPM alert and saw the engine oil pressure and fuel pressure lights illuminate. About 19:06:30, the pilot turned towards the East River and attempted to restart the engine, but was unsuccessful. The pilot then made a Mayday radio transmission. Preparing for the emergency landing, the pilot found that the fuel shutoff lever was in the up or shutoff position. The pilot realized that the front passenger's tether tail had pulled the lever up, shutting off the fuel flow to the engine. The pilot pushed the fuel shutoff lever down to restore fuel flow, but the helicopter was too low for the pilot to restart the engine. The pilot activated the emergency flotation system about 100 feet above the water. The helicopter touched down about 19:07:15. The helicopter then rolled over to the right and was inverted and submerged about 11 seconds after touchdown. Only the pilot was able to exit from the helicopter.
Mr. Chairman, apologies for the volume in the beginning of the video. Would you like us to replay any part of that?
I think it was okay, but thank you for offering.
Okay, Todd, if you
Could
would.
folks in the audience hear the first part of that? Yeah, so we're fine. Thank you for asking.
Okay. Todd?
Staff will be presenting the details of the safety issues that were evaluated during the investigation. These include lack of fuel shutoff lever, FSOL protection from inadvertent activation due to external influences such as interference from a passenger, emergency flotation system design, maintenance, and certification issues, the role of the harness tether system in passenger egress, the inadequacy of the review and approval process for supplemental passenger restraint systems, SPRS, following the accident, ineffective safety management in both Liberty and Nyan Air, Liberty and Nyan Air's exploitation of the aerial photography exception in 14 CFR 119 to avoid Federal Aviation Administration requirements and oversight, lack of policy and guidance for FAA inspectors to perform an oversight of Part 91 passenger carrying operations to ensure that operators are appropriately managing any associated risks. And finally, staff has identified the need for guidance and procedures for operators who carry passengers for hire in small aircraft to identify intoxicated or impaired passengers. Parties to the investigation were the Federal Aviation Administration, Liberty Helicopters, Nyan Air, and Dart Aerospace, which manufactured the helicopter's flotation system. In accordance with Annex 13 of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, and French Civil Accident Investigation Board, BEA, appointed an accredited representative to this investigation. Advisors from the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, Airbus helicopters, and Safran helicopter engines assisted with the investigation. Also, in accordance with ICAO Annex 13, Transportation Safety Board of Canada, TSB, appointed an accredited representative to this investigation. Advisors from Transport Canada and Eurotech Canada, which installed the flotation system, assisted with the investigation. I would also like to acknowledge staff who participated in this investigation. Chairman Sumwalt, this concludes my presentation. Mr. Shin will now continue with his presentation.
Good morning. I will discuss the design of the Airbus AS350 B2 floor-mounted controls and the design requirements for the fuel shutoff lever. Afterwards, I will discuss the performance of the DART emergency flotation system during the accident flight, the existence of high pull forces on the float activation handle, and certification review issues that were identified in the investigation. I will begin with an overview of the helicopter's floor-mounted controls. 3 floor-mounted controls were located adjacent to the pilot's collective control. The floor-mounted controls consisted of the rotor brake, the fuel flow control lever, and the fuel shutoff lever. The fuel shutoff lever provided a means to close the fuel supply valve between the fuel tank and the engine in an emergency. The certification basis for the fuel shutoff lever considered primarily scenarios in which a pilot may inadvertently select the wrong lever when operating a floor-mounted control. Airbus met this requirement by designing the fuel shutoff lever to have a different shape and color than its adjacent levers. The design of the fuel shutoff lever was not required to consider the risk of inadvertent activation due to external influences, such as passenger interference. Risks associated with such scenarios in normal category rotorcraft are typically controlled through operational measures such as pilot briefings to passengers and securing loose items. Although the fuel shutoff lever design was not required to protect against external influences, staff believes that a design modification that includes such protection could enhance safety more effectively than continued reliance on operational measures. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. I will now discuss the emergency flotation system designed by DART Aerospace that was installed on the accident helicopter via a supplemental type certificate. As seen in this image of an exemplar installation, the system consists of 6 skid-mounted floats, 3 on each side, that are inflated by 2 compressed gas reservoirs, 1 on each side. The emergency flotation system utilized a mechanical activation system to deploy the floats. An activation handle mounted adjacent to the base of the cyclic grip is pulled aft to deploy the floats. The intended design was for the pilot to pull the handle using the same hand holding the cyclic grip in a similar action to how a bicycle brake lever is operated without letting go of the handlebar. Only the left reservoir had discharged on the accident helicopter, resulting in partial and asymmetric inflation of the floats, with the left floats more inflated than the right floats. The discharge of both reservoirs was needed to fully inflate the floats. The investigation determined that a discharge of only one reservoir, even with symmetric inflation of the floats, would not enable a helicopter to remain upright in water. The investigation examined aspects that would preclude successful discharge of both reservoirs. The investigation determined that the activation system installation on the accident helicopter resulted in the need for high forces in excess of 58 pounds to pull the activation handle fully aft in order to discharge both reservoirs. Additionally, each reservoir could discharge at different points during aft travel of the activation handle. The investigation further determined that the activation handle on the accident helicopter had not been pulled through its full travel, resulting in the discharge of only one reservoir. Staff believes that high pull forces required to pull the activation handle, along with the oral and visual cues following the discharge of only the left reservoir, led the accident pilot to mistakenly believe that he had pulled the activation handle fully aft. At the time of the accident, there was no requirement to inspect and correct for high pull forces on the activation handle after installation of the emergency flotation system. Due to the lack of this critical information, staff believes that Liberty and other operators did not have a means to inspect and correct for high pull forces that may result from an installation anomaly or other issues. As a result of this investigation, DART introduced inspections to inspect and correct for high pull forces on the activation handle, both after initial installation and recurrently thereafter. The investigation determined that the FAA did not identify the absence of activation handle pull force limitations during the certification review of the DART emergency flotation system. Because the FAA used a similar certification review process to approve other rotorcraft emergency flotation systems, staff believes that deficiencies that may preclude their proper deployment, such as high pull forces on the activation handle, may exist on those systems. As the circumstances of this accident show, ambiguous control action feedback and high activation handle pull forces can lead to partial inflation of the float system in a situation in which no other malfunctions would preclude full inflation. A review of FAA guidance for design of emergency flotation systems found that it does not sufficiently address human factors aspects for activation systems. In summary, staff believes that safety would be improved by reviewing the activation system designs of other FAA-approved rotorcraft emergency flotation systems for deficiencies that may preclude their proper deployment, such as high forces on the activation handle. Improving guidance for assessing design features, usability, and inspection methods to ensure these important aspects are considered during the certification review process for such systems, and modifying the fuel shutoff lever design to enhance its protection against external influences. This concludes my presentation. Ms. Gibson will continue with her presentation.
Good morning. My presentation will discuss the passenger restraints and how they impacted passenger egress during the accident. I will also discuss the FAA's post-accident actions. In review, before the flight, passengers watched a Nyan Air safety video that included instructions for egress in the event of an emergency. Passengers were then fitted with body harnesses, and then they were taken to the helicopter. After boarding the helicopter, tethers were used to connect the passenger's harness to an anchor point in the cabin, and the FAA-approved restraints, which was a lap belt and a shoulder strap, was then secured over the harness. Passengers were provided headsets to hear the instructions from the pilot. Nyan Air developed the harness tether system to prevent passengers from falling out of Fly Nyan doors-off flights when the FAA-approved restraints were removed during the flight. A cutting tool was provided in a pouch on the harness for use in cutting these tethers. Lanyards attached to the harness were used to hold smartphones and cameras, and headset cords were zip-tied to the harness. A personal flotation device was also strapped around the passenger's waist. A tether was used to secure the harness to the helicopter. The tether was connected to a D-ring on the passenger's back and to a hard point in the cabin. Locking carabiners were used to make these connections. After the harness tether system was secured, lap belts and shoulder harnesses, the FAA-approved restraints, were fastened over the passengers' harnesses. Nyan Air's procedures specified, and the onboard video showed that the shoulder harnesses were routed under the arm rather than over the shoulder, and the lap belt was adjusted loosely. According to the pilot, this was to provide freedom of movement. In the safety briefing, passengers were told they could free themselves from the harness tether system using a quick-release clip on the back of their harnesses or use the cutting tool to cut the tether. However, the locking carabiners did not have quick-release features, and it would have been difficult for a passenger to reach, unlock, and open a carabiner rapidly in the event of an emergency. Cutting the tether using the cutting tool would also have been difficult because of the cross-routing of the tethers behind the passengers. Pilots had raised concerns about the effectiveness of the cutting tools. After the ditching, passengers were conscious and free from major traumatic injuries. However, the helicopter inverted and submerged in 11 seconds, reducing the time available for egress. All occupants experienced cold water immersion. The pilot was able to release his FAA-approved restraint to egress from the helicopter. However, the passengers were not able to egress and drowned. The inability for passengers to rapidly extricate themselves from the helicopter was a critical factor in the passengers' deaths. After the accident, the FAA issued an emergency order to mitigate the hazard associated with the use of occupant restraints preventing quick egress. This order required operators of doors-off flights to obtain an LOA for the use of supplemental passenger restraint systems, or SPRS. This required applicants to demonstrate that the SPRS could be quickly released with minimal difficulty and without the use of any knife, tool, or assistance. The SPRS also could not impede egress in the emergency and could not require passenger training beyond that of a pre-flight briefing. Although the FAA did provide guidance to inspectors about SPRS, the guidance did not address evaluating the specific need for an SPRS for a given operation, or performing a hazard analysis for an SPRS that considers the specific aircraft installation and the expected operational environment. For example, as this accident demonstrates, the use of the harness tether system in a helicopter equipped with floor-mounted controls presents a risk for control interference. In summary, staff believes the decision to use locking carabiners and cutting tools as the primary means for passengers to rapidly egress from the harness tether system was inappropriate and unsafe. The harness tether system likely contributed to the passengers' fatalities, as it did not allow the passengers to quickly escape from the helicopter. And the FAA's approval process for the SPRS does not address aircraft-specific installation hazards or the potential for entanglement that passengers may encounter during emergency egress. Staff is concerned that current FAA-approved SPRS installations that have not been comprehensively evaluated can result in emergency egress complications, leaving passengers vulnerable to being strained within a helicopter in the event that emergency egress is necessary. Staff believes that safety would be improved by prohibiting the use of these SPRSs until the SPRS system approval process has been revised. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Bramble will continue.
Good morning. I will discuss organizational factors in this accident. Nyon Air contracted with Liberty to operate Fly Nyon branded flights. Liberty was responsible for maintaining operational control over its flights, but overlapping management and other factors blurred the roles and responsibilities of personnel at the two companies. And Liberty's management allowed Nyon Air to influence core aspects of operational control, including safety management. In the year before the accident, Liberty stopped undergoing external safety audits. The director of safety resigned and was not replaced. The safety officer also resigned, and his replacement was not trained, was not familiar with the company's safety manual, did not hold quarterly safety meetings, and did not brief top management. Nyon Air lacked a formal safety structure, clear lines of accountability for safety management, and systematic processes for identifying hazards, prioritizing interventions, and mitigating risks. Nyon Air convened joint pilot meetings where safety and other matters were discussed, but these meetings were not effective for addressing Liberty pilot safety concerns. Our investigation showed that Liberty pilots were aware of potential hazards that played a role in this accident, including entanglement of items with floor-mounted engine controls, partial float inflation, difficulty accessing passenger carabiners, and ineffective cutting tools. Although the Liberty pilots expressed safety concerns about the passenger harness and tether system and recommended improvements, Liberty's CEO, COO, and DO were disengaged from day-to-day operations and did not advocate for the pilots' concerns. And the Nyon Air CEO chastised the pilots and deprioritized their concerns. Thus, ineffective safety management resulted in a lack of prioritization and mitigation of foreseeable risks. Safety would be improved by implementing an SMS requirement for all air tour operators. This concludes my presentation. Captain Lawrence will continue.
Good morning. I will now discuss the regulatory exception used by Liberty and Nion Air for the Fly Nion branded flights, including the accident flight, the lack of increased FAA surveillance, and the lack of policy and guidance available to FAA inspectors to support inspections of Part 91 revenue operations. As a general rule, aircraft operators conducting commercial operations must become certificated prior to engaging in transportation of passengers or property for compensation or hire. This means they must hold an FAA certificate and operate under the rules of Part 135 or 121. However, the regulations allow exceptions for certain operations from holding an FAA certificate, and depending on the operation, may allow the operator to fly under Part 91 with a letter of authorization, or LOA, or simply operate under Part 91 with no other requirements. Flights that are considered aerial photography flights, which are a subset of aerial work exception, do not require an operating certificate or LOA. The FAA originally created the aerial photography exception back in 1962. However, the terms aerial work and aerial photography have never been defined in the regulations. Investigators asked the FAA for a legal interpretation of the aerial photography exception, and the FAA said it was meant for business-like work-related operations such as news gathering, aerial mapping, surveying, commercial photography, or commercial filming. The FAA said the exception was not meant for personal, entertainment, or leisure purposes, similar to the purposes Liberty and Nion Air operated their Fly Nion branded flights. Without regulatory language that defines these terms consistent with the FAA's own legal interpretation, staff is concerned that operations could be conducted under these exceptions without the additional FAA requirements and oversight that apply to other commercial revenue passenger carrying operations. Both Liberty and Nion Air were aware of the aerial photography exception in the regulations, and their actions showed they exploited the exception to allow Fly Nion branded flights to continue operating under Part 91. For example, Liberty and Nion Air personnel were advised to avoid, as the chairman mentioned earlier, using words like air tour or sightseeing, which could trigger the requirement for an FAA Part 135 operating certificate or LOA, imposing additional oversight by the FAA. In addition, SOPs, or standard operating procedures, developed and used by both Liberty and Nion Air, also warned personnel to be vigilant for people who ask too many questions and mention words like tour, owners, management certificates, or appear to be the FAA or anyone with a badge. In October 2017, less than 5 months before the accident, FAA inspectors observed that Liberty Helicopters was operating doors off Fly Nion branded flights as aerial photography flights using Nion Air supplied passenger harness and tether systems. Liberty's principal maintenance inspector, or PMI, who saw the operation during a routine surveillance visit, characterized it as unorthodox and informed the principal operations inspector, or POI, and his manager of his concerns. The POI decided that since the operation was being conducted under Part 91, his only oversight authority was to ensure passengers were briefed and wearing their FAA-approved restraints. The POI said he did not feel compelled to look further at Liberty, and his perception that he was limited in his oversight ability underscores the need for revised guidance of FAA inspectors when surveilling Part 91 operations conducted under any exception to the regulations. In addition, the same POI had oversight authority of Liberty Helicopters Part 135 doors on commercial air tour certificate. When Liberty Helicopters entered into a charter agreement with Nion Air to operate primarily Fly-Nyan branded Part 91 aerial photography flights with the doors off and passengers harnessed and tethered to the helicopter, it constituted a significant change in the way Liberty Helicopters was operating its aircraft and flight crews. FAA guidance is clear that inspectors must evaluate the risks associated with these transition periods for a certificated operator, yet the Liberty Helicopters POI did not perform any additional surveillance for this change in operation at Liberty. The FAA has recognized that it has limited oversight authority of Part 91 operations. Staff is concerned the circumstances of this accident highlight problems with the level of safety oversight that the FAA applies to revenue passenger carrying operations conducted under any Part 91 operations versus a Part 135 or 121. Safety would be improved by codifying the definition of aerial photography to ensure those flights are only business-like or work-related and not flown for sightseeing purposes. And the FAA inspectors were provided better guidance for an operation conducted under any exception to the 14 CFR 119.1E regulations. Staff has proposed recommendations in both of these areas. Thank you. This concludes staff's presentations.
Well, thank you very much for those presentations, which I think do a very nice job of laying out the issues. And thank you for a very good investigation. We'll now turn to questions from the board and Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there seems to be a lot of question, perhaps, at least in some people's minds, about whether this was a Part 135 or a Part 91 operation and the level of oversight. So with commercial air tours, and correct me if I misspeak, they're required to have an operating certificate. There needs to be management personnel, operation specifications, FAA-approved training, FAA-approved maintenance program, drug and alcohol program, and a POI overseeing the operations. Was any of that required for Fly-Nyan?
Well, the list that you list for 135 is accurate. One of the problems we had with this investigation early on is when we asked the FAA for a legal definition of what this particular flight was operating on, was it 135, 91, 91 with an LOA, and we actually got 3 responses. POI said it was an aerial photography flight, which is just Part 91. We asked the FAA Legal for a definition. They couldn't really come up with one, but they said that it was not aerial photography because that's supposed to be more business-like. And then their third response was they finally came back and said, no, this should be a 91 under an LOA. And the fact that they gave us 3 different responses kind of told us that the regulations need more clarity so we know, and the FAA knows what type of operation this is. To answer your question, though, the last response we got from the FAA was a 91 with an LOA.
Yeah, this just strikes me that this is a loophole that one could fly a helicopter or drive a truck through. I went onto Fly-Nyan's website, and what they said there is, since inception in 2012, Fly-Nyan has flown over 250,000 passengers, and we now offer flights in Miami, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. That doesn't sound like either aerial work or a non-professional kind of operation. And FAA had difficulty understanding this?
They gave us 3 different responses until they finally gave us the final one that was an LOA.
Okay, you said in your presentation that the principal maintenance inspector thought this looked highly questionable, and he challenged the POI on this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the POI did nothing?
Well, when the PMI and the PAI, the avionics inspector, came back, because they both saw this during the surveillance, they talked to the POI and their frontline manager at the FSDO office to determine whether or not, what kind of oversight they had for a sightseeing. They determined within their own little bubble there that it was a Part 91 operation, and there wasn't any oversight they could do. What they didn't do, and we did during the investigation, is contact their legal department, which is a tool that's available to them to ask them, what was this supposed to be under? Had they done that, they would have got the same legal interpretation we received and said this was not aerial photography, it was an air tour.
I don't know quite how to characterize this, and as I think both you and Chairman have noted, there was a conscious effort to avoid describing this operation in any fashion that could possibly be construed as a commercial operation. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct, and the report lists multiple areas and events that would describe their effort to make sure this was kept under 91 and out of the visibility of the FAA.
And after the accident, what was Air Nion's response or Liberty Helicopter's response of why they did this?
I don't know if they had a response because the investigation was ongoing, and as parties, they weren't allowed to respond to that. The actions were that Liberty ceased doing any work or any flying, contractual flying for Nion Air. Nion Air continued their photography flights with the doors on until they received a approval under LOA for the supplemental restraint system, and then they began flying doors off helicopter operations with an approved SPRS, and they're doing that to this day.
Okay, so there are 91 LOA at this point.
Correct. Nion Air is using an East-West certificate that they are branded as a DBA. Nion Air is a DBA to East-West, and East-West holds the LOA, and they're flying 91 under an LOA right now.
So do they still have any of these other requirements levied upon them?
Only the requirements for Part 91 LOA, which would be they have to remain within 25 nautical miles, take off and land at the same airport. There's also 91-147 requirements that they have a drug and alcohol program, equipment requirement under 136. So there are restrictions and limitations under 91 with an LOA that apply to them today.
Thank you, Captain Lawrence.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Hamady.
Thank you. I think it's important that we keep in mind, and I always try to do this in board meetings, that not everybody who's watching or who's in the audience is an aviation expert. So we're using a lot of terms like 91, 119, 135, and LOAs. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about what is going on here so people fully understand how egregious this operation was, and in my opinion, still is today. Nion Air clearly used I would go even farther than what some would call a loophole, and just exploited this an opportunity to just avoid federal regulation. And it's my opinion that's exactly what they were doing. They had an LOA. Liberty was operating as Part 135, which was generally for charters at some point. And then at some point, the two companies, Nion Air hires Liberty, and they decide to do these aerial photography operations and avoid regulation. So my question is, how were they a 91 if the contract says they're a they have a charter agreement?
That's a very good question. And to get to your first response for the audience, when we talk about Part 91, it's essentially if you go out and a private pilot...
I'm going to get to that.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead on the
Oh,
question.
okay.
Yep.
The charter agreement that Nion Air had with Liberty specifically was charter. Anytime you hear charter, that should be Part 135, like an air tour. And so the language in that agreement said 135, Part 135. There are regulations that require operators, two certificated operators, if they contract with a charter agreement similar to what they had between them, they're required to notify the FAA. It's a regulatory requirement. And the FAA wants to know that because they want to know who has operational control of the flight that these two operators are in agreement with. That never occurred. And there was no contractual agreement that we had that showed Nyon Air and Liberty were agreed to fly these Nyon Part 91 flights.
Right, so and then a second question I have is how, before I get into the regulations, how Nyon is even operating right now? Because their LOA, they're doing business as Fly Nyon, correct?
That's correct.
So their LOA doesn't even list Fly Nyon. It used to.
Prior to the accident, Nyon Air did have an LOA. It didn't have anything to do with the particular accident.
Totally other operations.
Right.
Exactly.
But prior to the accident, they did have one that listed Fly Nyon as a DBA, but in September of this year, they revised their LOA, and right now, the only agreement that the FAA has for Part 91 LOA is between the DBAs Nyon Air and Foxtrot. Fly Nyon's
not Fly Nyon at all.
It's not listed on their current.
Okay, you'd think the FAA would know that. So when it comes to how they're regulated, how are they regulated? Well, so there are different regulations. So there's the certificate under 119, which they claimed they were exempted from because it was aerial photography, which it wasn't. And then there's the safety regulations, 121 for the large carriers, regional carriers, and cargo operations. You've got 125, you've got 135, which is generally charter and commuter, and then you've got 91, which is GA, right? So before this accident, what were the requirements that they were complying with? We have a chart in our draft report. What were they complying with? Basically GA, general aviation requirements, correct?
Right.
If you own a private airplane.
Just like a private airplane, they were aerial photography, just means Part 91, private aircraft. You can go out and do whatever you want.
The least restrictive.
Least restrictive, yes.
Not a lot. So how about 135? What would be the difference there? What would they have to comply with? And then what are they doing now? It's somewhere, it's not even in the middle. I'd say it's closer to 91 still.
Right. Under a Part 135 certificate, as an air tour operator, there is multiple aspects that they have to comply with. Training requirements approved, training, approved maintenance, approved management personnel. It's very comprehensive oversight and regulatory requirements. When you move down to Part 91 with an LOA, it's not near as robust, but there are restrictions and limitations that the FAA places on air tour operators operating with an LOA. And then, of course, the bottom one, which was what these operators were operating under with aerial photography, was just Part 91 general aviation.
But the restrictions are still extremely limited currently. Under 91 with the LOA.
Right, they are
They're
limited.
not 135.
They are not 135.
And I'm going to come back to that in the next round.
Thank you, Member Hamady. Ms. Gibson, do you agree that the fact that there were Nyon Air provided harnesses and the tether system, that likely contributed to the passenger fatalities because they were unable to escape the aircraft?
So in helicopter accidents that go inverted, disorientation and other effects of cold water immersion.
I'm just reading basically what is a proposed finding. So I understand immersion and all that. So what I want to know is, and this is what the finding says, the Nyon Air provided harness tether system likely contributed to the passenger fatalities because it did not allow passengers to quickly escape from the helicopter. Is that true?
So staff qualified the word likely because based on onboard video, we know that at least 2 of the passengers did have their FAA-approved restraints.
Yeah, I'm just looking for a yes or no. That's a proposed finding by staff.
Yes.
Okay. And so the point I'm trying to make is the contraption that Fly Nyon rigged up turned a perfectly good helicopter into a death trap. And that is a fact. So I want to ask you about this. These yellow harnesses, were they FAA approved? And Ms. Gibson or Captain Lawrence, were they FAA approved? Or was this just something you could go out and buy at Home Depot or Lowe's because it's basically a fall protection harness that a construction worker would wear?
Correct. It was not FAA approved. They were full-body fall protection harnesses.
That you could buy at Home Depot if you wanted to, yeah.
Yes.
But there were some that were, the blue harnesses were FAA approved, as I understand it, but, okay. The pre-flight video, it showed the tether being cut as if it was butter. I watched the pre-flight video. This knife would slice right through it. But was that an accurate portrayal of how easily it was to cut through the tether?
No, it wasn't. The tether that was used in the safety video that the passengers viewed was a different tether than what was used on board the accident helicopter.
Yeah, in fact, in the accident helicopter, for that type of tether, the Nyan Air lead pilot said she found it difficult to cut through, and it took her more than 30 seconds to cut through it. Do you recall that?
Yes, both Liberty and Nyan tested the effectiveness of the cutter with the tether, and they found it to be ineffective.
Yeah, so let's talk about some inconsistencies or incorrect portrayals in the video. The video said that you would cut through the harness with the knife. What would you really cut through?
The video stated that they would cut through the harness, when in all actuality, the video showed them cutting through the tether.
The video also showed cutting through a different webbing than that was actually installed.
Correct.
The safety video referred to something called a quick releasing clip. Is that correct?
It did.
Yes, but were they in fact quick releasing carabiners, or were they the screw-in type?
No, there was no quick release feature on the harness. They were locking carabiners.
So we found a lot of inconsistencies with the safety video that Nyan was showing and the reality.
Correct.
The whole reason, and I think I get this, the whole reason for the harness and tether system was to prevent people from falling out of a helicopter. And I tell you what, let me just come back to that. But is that basically what they put it in there for? I mean, they were worried about people falling out of the helicopter.
Yes, so the
Which would
intent
be
of their harness tether system was
Yeah,
to prevent passengers
and
from
that's a
falling out.
legitimate concern, as Mike and I were talking about it yesterday. Mike Hughes and I were talking about it. There's no turning back if you fall out of a helicopter. That's serious. So they were trying to mitigate that risk, but we'll talk more about that. Second round, Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shin, the flotation system was designed for single-hand operation. I believe it was attached to the collective or the cyclic control.
Yes, its intended design was for the pilot to operate
Right,
it
so
with one hand.
all I would need to do, because one usually needs at least 2 hands and 4 feet to fly a helicopter, is to be able to reach out if you needed to squeeze the handle, and that would deploy the canisters. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it was designed for single-hand operation, but it did not fully activate. We had an asymmetrical activation. Why?
In this event, because the activation handle was not pulled to its full travel, and because the reservoirs could activate at different points during the activation handle's aft travel, in this case, the pilot stopped pulling when, or we believe this pilot stopped pulling when he heard the first canister go, and the second canister did not discharge, leading to partial and asymmetric inflation of the floats.
How much force would be required to activate? I think we tested this on the accident aircraft.
We did, and the highest force we got was 58 pounds, in excess of 58 pounds.
That's a pretty strong force, is that correct?
Yes, in this case, the design, during the certification review, the APICAL, or DART Aerospace, had proposed to the FAA a 30-pound limit, and this is in excess of that 30-pound limit.
Almost double. Were these high pull forces unique to this particular helicopter, or did we find other helicopters that had something similar?
We did find with Liberty helicopters, the accident helicopter exhibited high pull forces. Videos provided by Liberty to investigators showed that they needed 2 hands to pull the activation handle on 2 other helicopters that had this emergency flotation system installed. In talking with other operators with this design system installed, one operator also experienced high pull forces that necessitated 2 hands, similar to how the Liberty pilots pulled the activation handle. One other operator up in Alaska said that they had an easy time pulling it with 1 hand. So we're seeing inconsistency throughout the installed population, but it's not unique to Liberty helicopters or the accident helicopter.
Captain Lawrence, this might be for you. Would this be something that would be checked by a maintenance inspector when they're doing routine maintenance on the aircraft to see if, in fact, the deployment system would function the way it's supposed to and would function with 1 hand rather than 2?
The Cheech would probably be better to answer.
Okay, Cheech.
The PMI probably would be not present for the actual ground testing. The maintenance requirements for the system requires a test inflation every 36 months. The PMI might check that that test inflation was done properly per the maintenance records. In this case, I don't believe the FAA PMI was present to see and witness the inflation tests. There's also no guidance within the RFM supplement for the system or in the maintenance manual describing that this is intended to be activated with 1 hand or giving pull force limitations that might cue mechanics or the director of maintenance that these high pull forces are anomalous.
I want to come back to this, but could you describe the supplemental type certificate program for the audience here and how that might differ from original aircraft certification?
In this case, the original certification for the helicopter was not originally certified for ditching. So when a applicant, a manufacturer, wants to design an emergency flotation system for this for this design helicopter, they would work with the FAA Aircraft Certification Office to determine what parts of the Part 27 regulation the system has to meet. Typically, they don't have to go beyond what the original certification standards were for that particular aircraft. So in this case, because the type certificate was approved back in the 70s, I believe, those revisions for the Part 27 regulations from the 70s would have applied.
Okay, I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Hamady.
Thank you. Dr. Bramble, what are NION's perceptions of their safety culture?
NION Air employees reported that they felt they had a very positive safety culture.
Yep. They said safety is our most important and #1 priority. And the CEO of NION pointed to their lead pilot as their safety officer, and then the lead pilot in interviews said she didn't know who the safety officer was of the company.
That's correct.
Little odd. So, have you ever heard the term rubber is racing?
No.
Did you ever watch Days of Thunder?
Perhaps a long time ago.
Right. So in Days of Thunder, this is a movie, Rowdy Burns, who's the arch rival of Tom Cruise, says, Tom Cruise's Cole Trickle says he's going to pull this rookie's chain, and he bumps him. And Tom Cruise, complains about it, and he says, it's part of the game. Whoever is running the pit says it's part of, you just have to keep driving. Rubber is racing. And so I say this because Nyon CEO says that's their motto, rubber is racing. Said it in a text. Rubber is racing, the saying we use at Nyon, rubber is racing, it's all good, people, and he's speaking about about Liberty's pilots at this point. People, the pilots, just can't get their snowflake feelings hurt. Because at numerous times, the pilots are saying that there are safety issues. Can you give a few examples of the concerns raised by the pilots?
Yeah, so the pilots were concerned about the yellow fall protection harnesses being ill-fitting on small people. They were concerned about the fact that the attachment point was up in the upper back where the passengers couldn't reach it. And they were concerned that the cutters were not effective for exiting the harnesses.
Yeah, and in looking through, so on the harnesses, Liberty pilots had stated to Nyon's CEO and I guess safety, who was supposed to be the safety officer, that they had delayed passengers from leaving because there was a very small young woman who the harness was too big, the yellow harness. So they sent back the CX, the customer service person, to go get the blue harness. Well, the CEO of Nyon then complains that why did you delay this? And the other people within the company complain that you shouldn't have delayed this. And no one's basically guaranteed these harnesses. It's not required by regulation. So the yellow ones are just as safe as the blue ones, even though it didn't fit this person because this person was smaller. And another time, in another instance, Liberty decides to cancel a morning flight because it's too cold. It's below 30 degrees, which conflicts with their internal flight procedures. It's 27. And so they cancel the morning flight, and the CEO of Nyon now complains and comes back in text and says, Brent, do you know when money doesn't come in, how many people stick around? 0. This morning has happened for us without safety concerns before. It threw a wrench in the day, my brand, expletive, expletive, expletive. And now my brand is getting destroyed because it's touching the likes of Liberty. Senior, who's his dad, who works at Liberty, has an earful coming from 80 degrees in Florida. So you have a situation where you have pilots numerous times at Liberty who are saying, hey, we've got serious safety concerns here. They keep raising it, and they keep getting shut down by the president at Nyon. Under the contractual agreement, who had operational control?
Liberty.
Or should have?
Liberty was supposed to exercise
Correct.
it.
And they had that actually in their flight operations manual, that Liberty is solely and ultimately responsible for the operational control of aircraft operations. But unfortunately, throughout this, they ceded that authority essentially to Nyon, correct?
Yeah, in a number of ways, including allowing Nyon Air to control the inventory and purchasing decisions around the harnesses.
And meanwhile, there's no safety reporting mechanism essentially, as confirmed by Nyon's lead
Correct.
pilot. Nobody on either side knows what an SMS is with either company. They don't know what a risk analysis is because neither of them can define that for any of our investigators. And at some point, they're kicked out of, the pilots from Liberty are kicked out of safety meetings, correct?
That's correct.
And we'll come back to that.
Well, and I want to follow on to that. Thank you, Member Hamady. Back to the idea that in one respect, they fly Nyon Air. They were trying to mitigate a risk of keeping people from falling out of helicopters. But as Jim Reason, who I quote often, says, for every management decision, there's a potential downside that has to be managed. So they decided to prevent people from falling out of the helicopter, we would tether them in. So, Dr. Bramble, what risk assessment did Nyon Air perform before using these harness systems?
They didn't do any kind of formal risk assessment like you would recognize from an engineering safety assessment. They had folks that were involved in aerial photography suggest types of tethers and harnesses and places to attach on the helicopter, but they didn't systematically look for how these harnesses could create risks.
They didn't look for that potential downside.
Mm-hmm.
And along those lines, what risk assessment did Liberty perform before conducting doors off operation?
Again, nothing systematic. However, they did attempt to at least cut the tether with the cutter and found that it was difficult to do so.
Found that it was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The pilots did.
Yes. The Liberty Director of Operations said that a flight risk assessment tool, that's something that is widely used throughout aviation nowadays. We score, well, we have the pilot that slept less than 8 hours, so we're going to give that a score. The weather is below these minimums or something, and you come up with a score.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this board has talked about that in the past. The Liberty Director of Operations said that a flight risk assessment tool was a bureaucratic morass. I have no idea what that means. What does that mean? It probably means that he didn't think it was a great idea.
Yeah, that he was dismissing a sort of a systematic approach to safety management or didn't understand what it was about.
I think Member Hamady mentioned that the previous safety officer left Liberty in January, just a few months before the accident. Why did he leave?
Because he disapproved of doing these doors-off flights with Nyan Air.
And he also thought that the authority of Liberty's chief pilot was being undermined by Nyan Air's CEO.
That's correct.
How long was the Liberty Director of Safety position vacant?
It was vacant for around 5 months, I think.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the Liberty hazard reporting system. They had a hazard reporting system. Was it being widely used?
No,
It was not being used at all, or it wasn't being used.
it was not being used.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And I'm going to go back to Dr. Reason, where when he defines a safety culture, one of the attributes of a safety culture that he mentions is a reporting culture. And here is the lack of a reporting culture, because the very tool that they have, Liberty had in place to allow reports, wasn't even being used. What is, maybe Dr. Bramble, maybe Captain Lawrence, what is the TOPS, Tour Operators Program of Safety? What is that?
TOPS is an industry safety organization of air tour operators that promulgates voluntary safety standards.
Yeah, they're looking for best in class and exceeding the regulatory requirements. And is Liberty, at the time of the accident, were they a member of TOPS?
No, they had left the program in early 2017.
They left, the reason they stated was to save money.
Correct.
And in doing so, now here I looked at their 2016 audit that TOPS performed of Liberty, and it was 127 pages in length, so it must have been pretty comprehensive, yet Liberty pulled out to save money. This was a program that was designed to raise the safety bar, and yet they pulled out.
That's correct, and that was in large part why they even had a safety manual and a director of safety in the first place.
Great. Well, very good. Thank you for the very crisp answers. I appreciate that. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going back to floats here for a minute. We know that the right side floats did not inflate. There was an asymmetric inflation. And when the system was originally certified, there was, I guess they used 2 canisters. Was that the idea, that you would inflate one side with each canister?
That's correct. The original certification design was without a crossover hose. There was no interconnection between the left and right sides. The left canister would inflate the left floats. The right canister would only inflate the right floats.
This would seem intuitively obvious, but just to get it on the record. So an asymmetric deployment would probably be worse than no deployment at all. Is that correct?
I guess it depends on whether you talk to someone that says it's better to have that advance warning that one side's has not deployed, so you know that you will capsize, versus not knowing that you have partial inflation and that you will capsize.
Okay. So when was the crossover hose added?
In 2000, DART added the crossover hose to the design via a service bulletin.
And the purpose of the crossover hose was?
As per stated in the service bulletin, it was intended to alleviate asymmetric inflation and to allow for all 6 floats to partially inflate when only one of the reservoirs discharges.
Did that work?
In this case, we had all 6 floats partially inflate, but there was still asymmetric inflation in that, in this case, since the left reservoir discharged, the left side floats were still more inflated than the right side floats.
So the crossover hose did not perform its intended function.
That appears so, yes.
So isn't that in contrast to what the supplemental type certificate requirements are, that whatever you do is supposed to perform its intended function?
In this case, the float system itself's intended function is to keep the helicopter upright and afloat in an emergency landing on the water or ditching. And the intended design is for both cylinders to activate to fully inflate the floats.
Okay.
So,
But we've seen some cases where that hasn't happened.
correct, in this case, the one cylinder or one reservoir discharged, the crossover hose inflated the right side floats, but not enough. And based on the investigation testing, you need both cylinders to fully inflate the floats. Even with one cylinder discharging, you will not have enough buoyancy to keep it upright.
So it's not performing its intended function.
The crossover is not.
Would you say that the FAA's oversight and review of these emergency flotation systems is adequate?
During the investigation, we did not have access to enough of the certification data to assess the rigor of testing done during the assessment of the system. So while we did identify the lack of pull force limitations, we couldn't assess why that information was absent.
Well, going forward, what should the FAA do to ensure that similar installations do not have such deficiencies? I mean, it clearly, this accident is a study in Murphy's Law. Pretty much everything that could go wrong did. And the idea was that the floats would be there in case something happened with the aircraft engine, and you could be able to land on the water and people would have a reasonable opportunity to get out. That didn't work. So what should the FAA be doing here to address this? Because I'm sure a lot of helicopter operators are depending upon these systems as the backup in case something else goes wrong.
In this investigation, since we determined that there was high pull forces on the activation handle on this particular design, we have proposed a recommendation for the board to consider for the FAA to review the activation systems of other helicopter emergency flotation systems to ensure they don't have the same issues and deficiencies we found in this investigation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Landsberg and Member Hamady.
I guess Dr. Bramble, and if I'm wrong, let me know. Would the average consumer know the risks involved with these flights?
I don't believe so. I don't believe they would have been aware of the specific risks that were involved in this case.
So on the photo that you provided at the beginning of the video, the source there was one of the witnesses who was on another helicopter flight out of the same terminal, same operation entirely that day. And he had said He described walking into Fly Nyon's gleaming new terminal in New Jersey with its bar for parties and corporate events, a room with virtual reality gear for flight demonstrations, and a command center with monitors on the wall showing maps of the city and lots of workstations lined up in rows beneath them. Though hokey, such glossy presentations do indeed inspire confidence. And so people walking off the street, you and me, just maybe we would know more because of what we do, but anybody else would not know the risks involved generally. So that's where my concern is. So then I want to turn really quickly to then how they're regulated. So back to you, Mr. Lawrence. And I do want to thank you very much for a very detailed operational factors group chairman's report, because I was able to follow all the footnotes and everything else, because there's a lot there for how these are regulated. So thank you for providing all that information. It's helpful. So Part 91 is for GA operations. Bruce has a plane. He for his personal use, so he falls under Part 91. It's personal operations, so it is the least restrictive, but he's not doing anything for hire or for compensation. He's really focused on his own personal use of that aircraft. This operation is under Part 91, and it has a letter of authorization, an LOA, and so the requirements are you have to operate under around a 25-mile radius. And the letter of authorization, it doesn't really have a lot of restrictions. It's really who's the operator, what's the principal business address or mailing address, the name of the person responsible for management, the name of the person responsible for aircraft maintenance, the type of aircraft, registration, make, model, and what is your anti-drug and alcohol misuse prevention program. And that's it, correct?
There are also 136 requirements.
There are. But the 136 is not a whole lot.
Correct.
What we are on record as stating that these operations, air tours, because this is an air tour, should be under what?
Our 1995 SIR recommendations were for them to be under 135, all of these air tours.
All of these air tours should be under 135. They're air tours, and they are not for personal use. They are transporting passengers for compensation or hire, correct? And therefore, they should be under stricter regulations, Part 135. And in fact, what we state, because at the time, we closed that what? That recommendation.
It was closed unacceptable action.
Closed unacceptable. Because the FAA at the time, and we have letters going back and forth between us and the FAA, which we state specifically for Part 91 air tour operations, the new letter of authorization, because at the time we said it should be under 135, FAA came back in a rulemaking and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to say they're under 91 with an LOA with 136, which is exactly what they're operating now, right? So we stated at the time, Part 91 air tour operations, the new letter of authorization and Part 136 requirements do not provide for mandatory FAA oversight, nor does the final rule incorporate for all air tour operations the recommended initial and recurrent pilot training programs, maintenance policies and procedures, flight scheduling that fosters adequate breaks in flight periods, or operations specifications that address management, procedures, route specifications, and altitude restrictions. We continue to believe that a regulation specific to commercial air tour operations that establishes safety standards in the areas recommended is needed and would allow FAA inspectors responsible for air tour operators to focus on the daily safety requirements unique to those operations. So we said 91 plus an LOA plus 136 is unacceptable, right? They should be under 135. That's what we said.
That was with the recommendation back in 95, right?
And we closed it unacceptable because that's not what they did. They allowed for 91 with an LOA with 136, which is exactly what Fly-Nyan is operating under today. 91 with an LOA with 136. So would you say that it's acceptable now for a commercial tour operator to be under 91, 136 with an LOA when we have been on record that it should be 135? Dana.
I think looking at the facts of this accident.
I'm not talking about the exemption.
Well, I think the board is on record that we believe 135 as
For-
an operating regulation is the most safe or the most conservative for air tour. But noting that in this particular investigation, what we found is that they weren't even operating as a Part
Right,
91 air
exactly.
tour.
They weren't, but here's my concern, and I'll raise this later. My concern is, I don't want to wait for another accident. I don't want to wait for another accident then to come back again and say, you know what? We actually weren't okay with the current how Fly-Nyan is operating under 91 with an LOA and a 136, because we have on record they should have been a 135. Yet we don't address that. They should have been a 135. FAA, it was closed unacceptable because the FAA didn't do it. We continue to see accidents. I went on an accident investigation. I was launched to a parachute operations accident in Hawaii in June. B-17. And there have been numerous accidents where these fall under exemption. So I am going to come back to this. I know I'm over my time. I'm sorry.
Hey, well, thank you, Member Hamidini. You raised a question in my mind, and Captain Lawrence, when Liberty would do air tour flights out of, and I mean literally air tour flights out of the Lower Manhattan, East Manhattan, whatever it's called, the heliport that they used to conduct air tour flights out of on a regular basis. Under what rules were they operating then? 91 with an LOA or Part 135?
It would depend on what the routing was, but typically those were 135 operations that they're.
Yeah, so that's sort of interesting there. Here, the same operator, if they were doing advertising as air tour operators, they were operating under Part 135. But now they go over across the river, whatever river that would, the Hudson, and get over into New Jersey and operate under the banner of Fly-Nyan. They're operating under a considerably lower level of regulatory standards. Did I capture that correctly?
Accurate.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for setting up the question in my mind. So thank you. I want to go back to some of the safety culture related issues. And Dr. Bramble, how much support did the Liberty pilots receive when they voiced operational and safety concerns with Fly-Nyan?
I would say they didn't receive very consistent support from their high-level management. Every once in a while, the director of operations or chief pilot would step in and put their foot down over something like, we need a cold weather operations policy, but largely Liberty's top management was disengaged from day-to-day operations and the pilots' day-to-day safety concerns.
When asked about Nyan management attitude towards managing safety, the Liberty safety officer said that when we had concerns, they were shut down. And the director of training for Liberty said that in a January 2018 pilots meetings where Liberty pilots raised concerns, the Nyan Air CEO smitted, it's a new word for me, but smitted the Liberty pilots. What does that word smitted mean?
I believe to smite is to strike.
Smite, thank you. Mm-hmm. The Liberty safety officer asked if there was pressure from Nyan to operate in a way that was contrary to what the pilot felt was safer, and what was his response? It was one word: absolutely. That comes out of his interview summary, that he felt that there was pressure from NION to operate in a manner that when the pilots felt that that was contrary to safety. Remember, Hamidi talked about the cold weather operations. Remember, you're flying a helicopter without doors, so it's going to be cold, and the pilots would lose the feeling in their hands. You operate a helicopter with, as the vice chairman said, 2 hands and 4 feet.
Maybe the other way, too.
Maybe the other way around. You don't want to lose the feeling in your hands, and the CEO put pressure on Liberty, saying that they should not turn down flights, that Liberty needed the money, and how was he defined as the NION Air CEO was defined as throwing a what? Throwing a fit about this, that they canceled flights because it was below their agreed upon weather minimums. I'll cut it off there. I'll go to Vice Chairman.
Captain Lawrence, I read a quote off of Fly NION's website here earlier that they were very proud of the fact that they were flying 250,000 passengers in 3 areas. Have we had any discussion with the FAA as to why they don't think this is a commercial operation? And how would they justify that? That may be a rhetorical question, I don't know, but.
Well, in their final response to us to definitively say the operation was a Part 91 with an LOA, they brought us no justification on how they got to that.
They've flown 250,000 passengers, and it's not considered a passenger carrying operation? I'm confused. Okay. I want to talk just briefly. This is probably a somewhat sensitive topic, but I think well, before I get to that, Ms. Gibson, how long would it take somebody to get out of a submerged helicopter, assuming they weren't injured?
Well, when helicopter accidents go in inverted, a level of disorientation and the effects of cold water immersion do set in. So it's hard to tell.
Okay, so indeterminate, and we know that the U.S. military spends a huge amount of time and effort to train people with simulators to escape from helicopters without supplemental restraints, that they just have the regular situation. I mean, this just sounds like a potential for disaster right from the get-go without a little more training. Is that a reasonable statement, or is it not?
Yes, it is.
Describe what happens with cold water impairment.
I'll defer that to Dr. McKay.
So there's an initial shock, and typically people almost immediately hold their breath. But very quickly, hypothermia begins to set in, and fine motor movements may be impeded in water that was approximately 40 degrees. The water temperature was very cold. The ability to then manipulate the things that needed to be manipulated, both for the FAA restraints, but also for this tether, would have been very difficult to accomplish in water at that temperature.
Okay, well, that goes to my Murphy's Law observation here that, we just have one thing after another, and nothing is working particularly well. And Ms. Gibson, I think you said with the tether, and then I'll leave it alone, is this thing was mounted behind, and they were either supposed to unscrew this locking carabiner, or barring that, being able to slice through with a knife. Am I understanding how this is supposed to work?
Yeah, the 2 methods of egress that NION Air provided their passengers were that they were to unlock this locking carabiner that was on the D ring on the backs of their harnesses, which would be extremely difficult, if not near impossible, to do. or
So
to cut the
pretty
tether.
obviously impossible to do.
Correct.
And FAA had nothing to say about this. Captain Lawrence?
I'll defer to Ms. Gibson as far as the SPRS system.
So the answer is they had nothing to say.
Right, there was no oversight on those Heather Torres systems.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Hamady.
I don't know if it's worse that they had nothing to say or actually what they did say, which when they did finally go out to visit NION on October 31st, 2017, which this was the first time they had become aware of these operations. They took pictures, voiced concerns, and the statement was, it seemed like a very unorthodox situation. But then they never came back. They didn't do anything. They decided it was okay, and then didn't even seek legal interpretation like we could have. So let me ask you, before this accident, did Liberty ever operate doors off?
According to their chief pilot, it was very rare in the past and was always with the occupants and their FAA restraints, not with a supplemental system.
Correct. And in fact, it was like 15 years earlier during a boat race, they said. So most of the people who are now there weren't there at that time, 15 years ago when they did this during a boat race. When they decided to do these harnesses with tethers, it was anchored in at certain points in the back. It was the bottom of the seats, and in the front, for the front passenger, it was on the floor. What are those anchors usually used for in these Airbus helicopters?
I can answer this one. The seat belts on this particular
Not the seat belts, the anchors for the
on the cabin floor,
that the tethers were anchored
typically
to.
for cargo.
Cargo. So did NION or Liberty ever do a test of using these workplace harnesses with tethers to see if it would work with the configuration of the aircraft and actually preventing a fall? Did they ever do any testing of their anchored tether system?
No, they did not.
No. And who developed this safety harness system? NION, right? And how were they developed?
So the harness tether system that NION Air used was developed by NION Air, and they took in consideration company pilots' input, as well as they had company personnel that had extensive experience in the film industry.
Well, and there was somebody outside the company that they used at the time, somebody that they worked with on production of movie production, film production, photography, to get that person's input. Did we interview that person? Would that person be interviewed?
We did not interview
No,
him,
because they didn't. Were there any aviation safety experts actually consulted in development of these harness tether systems?
No.
No. Are there OSHA regulations for how workers are trained for using these fall protection harnesses?
There are OSHA requirements, yes.
But they don't apply here because these are for workplace hazards for people who use them in workplaces, and they have training. So oil workers who fly over water to get to rigs are trained on how to use harnesses. People who use them to maybe conduct work off of bridges, say a rail bridge over water, would be trained on how to use them by OSHA regulations.
That's correct.
So somebody off the street was just expected to know how to use this and then get out of it. In how many seconds did that helicopter get submerged?
It went inverted in 11 seconds.
11 seconds for inversion. So they were supposed to, and then on top of that, and what we haven't talked about really quickly, because I only have 30 seconds in this round, headsets. Have we looked at the headset issue in other accidents where headsets may have gotten tangled and didn't pull out of their anchor point?
We do have a recommendation on headsets.
So, I mean, and what is that? Do we know?
I'll defer that safety alert.
I'm not sure at the moment, but I can get back to you on that.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, we have a headset recommendation because we're concerned about entanglement. And so you have headsets, you've got the, this cutter, which was really for seatbelts. It wasn't for these tethers. You've got the safety harness issue, and I know we said in the video, and I do want to make very clear here, that the front passenger, we said in the video, was leaning back and pulled the tether pulled the fuel off lever. That passenger didn't do anything wrong because they were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing on that flight and why they went on that flight, which was to take pictures, leaning back for shoe selfies, which is exactly how Fly Nyan marketed it, correct? I just want to be very clear on that.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna come back on other things.
Thank you, Member Hamady. While we're talking about the tether, as I recall, if I were to be seated on, say, the far, in the back, on the bench, say I was seating outboard on the left, my tether would actually be secured behind the person next to me. Is that correct?
If you were seated on the outboard seat, your tether was connected to the hard point on the opposite seat of the other outboard side of the helicopter.
Way over there. So,
Way over there.
So here's a tether that's going from back here. Actually, it's anchored in behind my shoulder blades, which I can't even reach, and it's way behind the vice chairman over there. So, and it's pretty tight to begin with because it's to keep me from falling out of the helicopter. So when I turn to try and cut it, what happens to the tightness, the tautness of that tether?
It becomes taut.
So I'm trying to turn, but it's tight.
Yes.
I think it was very tragically ironic what the pilot said in the pre-flight briefing. He said to the passengers, "You're tethered in, you're not going anywhere." I think that's tragically ironic. I do want to talk about the pilot performance. Within 2 seconds, he initiated an auto-rotative descent. He attempted to relight the engine as he was descending in an auto-rotation. He went to shut off the fuel shut-off lever, but that's when he discovered that it had actually already been shut off, and then he slammed it back down to try and open the valve again, then go back to try to relight the engine. He did activate the floats. He had a lot going on in that less than a minute. And I was frankly impressed that he got that much done under a very, very high stress situation. Now, we did talk about the flotation handle was not pulled back as far as it could be. But let's talk about that. This handle is 32 degrees offset to the right. Now, if you're going to get the greatest anthropometric strength, you would pull something straight back. Now you're trying to hold the cyclic with one hand, as if it's designed that way, rotate your hand this way, 32 degrees, and grab this handle. And by the way, it's not like a bike handle where it's just right there. It was a pretty good reach. So, in fact, I don't see how a person could actually keep the cyclic in the hand. Well, and that's why they use two hands. That's right. I do want to ask a question. Anyway, we did say that he did not pull the handle far enough, but it required 58 pounds of force to pull it far enough to inflate, to activate both of the reservoirs versus the design of 30, which the Vice Chairman's already pointed out is nearly double. I do want to ask a question. The ground speed at touchdown was about 20 to 24 knots. The recommended speed to land with the floats extended is 10 knots. Is there any indication at all that the higher speed may have defeated the inflation system?
We didn't see evidence of damage on the floats that would have precluded full inflation at the higher speed.
Okay, so in other words, the higher speed that didn't cause the floats to rupture or anything like that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one clarification on the pull force. So 58 pounds was insufficient to get both to activate, and it wasn't until greater force that was unmeasured was applied that in testing we were able to get it to activate.
Wow. So it was more than twice the design strength. How much can a person squeeze like that?
So there is human engineering data on this from the Air Force, and a 5th percentile adult male can exert a momentary force of 59 pounds and a sustained force of 35 pounds. And that's assuming ideal ergonomics with a handle that's close together and in line.
Yeah.
It's probably less than that in this scenario.
Yeah, because you agreed that having it 32 degrees offset even decreases the strength of somebody to be able to pull it accurately. Thank you. Member Hamady.
Good. All right. After the accident, the FAA issued an emergency order regarding supplemental passenger restraint systems for doors-off flight operations conducted for compensation or hire. And it prohibits the use of such systems unless they can be released quickly in an emergency during flight operations. So this EO, emergency order, applies to all operators and pilots of doors-off flights for compensation or hire. Not just passenger carrying, it applies for all for compensation or hire, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so, but then in addition to it, it says if you're gonna, the order prohibits passenger carrying doors-off flight operations for compensation or hire unless the passengers use the seatbelts. I'm paraphrasing the seatbelts, FAA-Approved Restraint Systems.
Correct.
Okay. So it says you can't use these restraint systems unless you unless you get a letter of authorization, an LOA, which was separate from their operating letter of authorization. So Nyon Air, after the accident and after the EO, submitted for a letter of authorization, correct? And it included a 7-second video of their new harness system, which they say is quick release, correct?
Correct.
Did the FAA view the video, or did they go to their operations, look at the harnesses? Do you know?
It is my understanding that no. They
No,
look
they
at
didn't.
the submission package that the operator submitted only.
The 7-second video.
The video. and
That's
the-
what they looked at to approve the LOA, was the 7-second video that's currently being used.
And the information that is provided in the
Which was pretty
application.
limited.
Correct.
And so were the new harnesses tested by FAA, or was it just sort of a similar, hey, these are used for search and rescue? Now we have tethers that are, not tethers, that are more releasable. We don't use the carabiners. the harnesses.
The harnesses were not tested, no.
No, not tested. So 7 seconds. Are there, it does though say that everyone has to maintain wearing their FAA authorized restraints, which are the seatbelts. So for the middle backpack passengers, I guess they'd be considered seat position 2 and 3. So they are now no longer unclipping their seatbelts and then coming down onto they're not rotating out or any of that, right?
No, they're
It's
not.
just doors off operations and they have the harness. So I'm trying to figure out if there's no testing and FAA looked at a 7-second video and this helicopter inverted in 11 seconds, how it's any safer that you now have a harness that you have to quick release. You have a FAA restraint, a seatbelt that you have to quick release, and then you have to get over the headset, which we have said can possibly cause entanglement, and then get out after no testing.
That's right, and that's why we have the recommendation to the FAA to modify their current SPRS LOA process, because we found it inadequate.
Okay, so, and that set me up for why did we find it was inadequate, and what do the staff's what are the staff's recommendations for improving the emergency order or this approval process?
We found it inadequate because it didn't look at certain things that we felt like that it should. One being the need for the SPRS, as well as the intent behind it. It didn't look at specific aircraft installation in the aircraft that they may be using this SPRS in, or multiple aircrafts, and where the installation of this SPRS would be. They did not look at the operational environment of the SPRS. Multiple people perhaps using these SPRS systems, looking at things like the headset cords and other entanglement issues.
I'm going to come back to that.
Just out of curiosity, how much longer do you want to go? Why don't you just finish that out, and then I'll ask. I've just got a few too.
And so what makes us think FAA is going to implement those recommendations? Because I got to tell you, we've issued a lot of recommendations to the FAA. One we just heard about that was in 1995 that would have put this operation under more stringent requirements that they rejected. So what makes us think FAA is going to implement these?
We do have concerns that this be acted on quickly. In fact, that's why we are also recommending that until it's done, that this be stopped, that these operations with passengers, paying passengers, be stopped with the SPRS. So we are concerned that there needs to be a much higher standard for how these restraints are actually evaluated and validated to be safe.
And I have to tell you, before this board meeting, the FAA came in to meet with me, and it was a good meeting. It was good meeting the people there involved with investigations. But there was a comment in that meeting that made me pause by the FAA, which said, at some point, we really need to start talking about, and we are going to start talking about, passenger responsibility when it comes to these operations. I mean, you assume, and we just talked about, you assume as passengers that these are under these operations are under a high level of scrutiny, that there are safety measures put in place, that that the FAA required some sort of testing of harnesses, that it's perfectly safe to have doors off operations from people just walking off the street. And yet the FAA's focus in our conversation was, well, we really have to look at the the responsibility of passengers to just say no. I was really disappointed. I mean, that's saying it lightly. So that's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Hamady. You know, we point out sometimes our frustration with the FAA, but I do want to acknowledge that we issued an urgent safety recommendation on March the 19th. It was an urgent rec, and I think it's very important that the NTSB be able to react quickly on things like this. And we came out with an urgent safety rec within 8 days of the accident. The FAA did, to their credit, on March 22nd, they came out with their own emergency prohibition. And so I want to acknowledge that. I want to point out the importance of the NTSB acting quickly. And I want to acknowledge that the FAA did act quickly as well. But there's more work that needs to be done. And we will talk about that when we get into our recommendations. I just want to close out with a couple of questions. Sean Payne, thank you for your good work on the recorders. I talked to you yesterday briefly about this. The Apario unit, so as I understand it, Airbus helicopters a few years ago, in fact, it was probably around
2014.
2014 is when they started as standard equipment installing the Apario Vision 1000 as standard equipment.
Yes, starting with the AS350.
Starting with that. And they caught heat. I remember people telling me that they caught heat for doing this as standard equipment because some people said they didn't want it. But Airbus said this is the right thing to do, and we want to put this in helicopters so that there can be a flight data monitoring program. But what was the status of the Apario unit on this on the accident helicopter?
So we determined that this particular unit suffered a software failure. Was running an old version of software on board the camera that was had an available update from the manufacturer of the camera to alleviate this problem.
And the software or the firmware update was available, but are you saying that Liberty just did not install it?
In fact, no, they did not install the update. And in fact, the director of maintenance, I believe, was unaware of the camera's existence.
They did not even know that there was this equipment on board the helicopter that could provide valuable information about how their flights were being conducted, not only by having a camera to go back and watch how these flights are being flown, but it would capture data as well, parametric data.
That's correct. It would have been similar to a basic flight recorder.
They didn't even know that it was there. They did not update it. So as a result, the last recorded data on this box was, what, July of 2014 or so?
That's correct.
So we got no data out of this.
That's correct.
Well, that could possibly speak to the way that Liberty Helicopters was being operated at the time. Are there any further questions from my colleagues? We're going to take a break. We'll come back at 11:45. We're in recess. If everyone would please be seated, we'll begin in about 1 minute. We're back in session, and do either of my colleagues have any additional questions for the staff at this point? Great. Well, Ms. Bryson, if you'd please read the proposed findings.
Yes, sir. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 20 findings. Number 1, none of the following were factors in this accident. 1, the pilot's qualifications, which were in accordance with federal regulations and company requirements. Number 2, pilot fatigue or medical conditions. And number 3, the airworthiness of the helicopter. Finding number 2, the tail of the front passenger's tether caught on the fuel shutoff lever, or the FSOL, during the flight, which resulted in the inadvertent activation of the FSOL interruption of fuel flow to the engine and loss of engine power. Number 3, the pilot auto-rotated the helicopter successfully and pulled the emergency flotation system activation handle to deploy the floats at an appropriate time. However, the floats inflated partially and asymmetrically. Liberty Helicopters, Inc. and Nyan Air's decision to use locking carabiners and ineffective cutting tools as the primary means for passengers to rapidly release from the harness tether system was inappropriate and unsafe. Number 5, the helicopter's landing was survivable. However, the Nyan Air provided harness tether system likely contributed to the passenger fatalities because it did not allow the passengers to quickly escape from the helicopter. Finding number 6, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, approval process for supplemental passenger restraint systems, SPRS, that was implemented after the accident is inadequate because it does not provide guidance to inspectors to evaluate any aircraft-specific installations or the potential for entanglement that passengers may encounter during emergency egress. Finding 7, although the crossover hose in the accident helicopter's emergency flotation system design did not perform its intended function to alleviate the asymmetric inflation of the floats during a single reservoir discharge event, buoyancy stability testing showed that even symmetric distribution of the gas from only one reservoir would not enable the helicopter to remain upright in the water. Finding number 8, in the absence of information from DART specifying pull force limitations for the emergency flotation system's activation handle, Liberty and other operators lack a means to inspect for and correct high pull forces that may result from an installation anomaly or other issues. Finding number 9, although the accident pilot was aware that each gas reservoir may not discharge simultaneously, the high forces required to pull the activation handle, along with the oral and visual cues following a single reservoir discharge, led the pilot to mistakenly believe that he had successfully pulled the handle fully aft to fully inflate the floats. Finding number 10, the Federal Aviation Administration's certification review of the emergency flotation system design installed on the accident helicopter did not identify DART's omission of an activation handle pull force limitation. Thus, the FAA's reviews of other approved emergency flotation system designs may not have identified similar omissions. Finding number 10, improved guidance for aircraft certification offices for assessing design features, usability, and inspection methods that ensure successful deployment of an emergency flotation system could help ensure that these important aspects are considered during the certification review process for such systems. Finding number 12, through their repeated lack of involvement in key decisions related to Liberty Helicopters' operated fly-Nyon flights, Liberty's managers allowed Nyon Air personnel, particularly Nyon Air's chief executive officer, to influence core aspects of the operational control of those flights. Finding 13, ineffective safety management at both Liberty Helicopters, Inc. and Nyon Air resulted in a lack of prioritization and mitigation of foreseeable risks. Number 14, Liberty Helicopters and Nyon Air exploited the exception at Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations 119.1 E43, allowing aerial photography flights to be operated under Part 91, thereby avoiding the additional Federal Aviation Administration requirements and oversight that apply to commercial air tours conducted under either Part 135 or Part 91 with an air tour letter of authorization. Finding number 15, without regulatory language that defines the terms aerial work and aerial photography to include only business-like, work-related aerial operations, operators may attempt to take advantage of the exception at Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations 119.1 E43 to carry revenue passengers for personal, entertainment, or leisure purposes without the additional Federal Aviation Administration requirements and oversight that apply to other commercial revenue passenger carrying operations. Finding 16, the Federal Aviation Administration Principal Operations Instructor assigned to oversee Liberty Helicopters, Inc., did not conduct additional surveillance of Liberty's operations after being made aware of its fly-Nyon flights and failed to ensure that Liberty was appropriately managing the risks associated with the significant change in operations. Sorry, I misspoke. It's inspector and not instructor. Thank you. Finding number 17, because the Federal Aviation Administration continues to allow passenger revenue operations to be conducted under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 91, some of which, like the fly-Nyon flight operations, transport thousands of passengers annually, the FAA must provide inspectors with sufficient guidance to pursue more comprehensive oversight with regard to potential hazards they observe and to ensure that operators sufficiently mitigate risks. Finding 18. Although the certification basis for the accident helicopter's fuel shutoff lever did not require protection from inadvertent activation due to external influences, a design modification that includes such protection could enhance safety more effectively than continued reliance on operational measures. Finding 19, the risk of the Nyon Air provided harness tether system, tether tail, becoming entangled with the floor-mounted fuel shutoff lever existed independently from passenger intoxication and most likely depended primarily on the passenger's positioning in the cabin. And number 20, when passengers are seated in close proximity to an aircraft's controls, it is critical that they not be impaired to reduce the likelihood of interference with the pilot's ability to safely fly the aircraft.
Thank you, Ms. Bryson, for reading those proposed findings. Are there any proposed amendments other than the one that I proposed? Great. I'd like to make a motion. And just for your reference, what I'm about to motion is what we distributed. Why are you shaking your head? No, Kathy. Okay. See, I do pay attention. What I'm going to propose is exactly what we emailed out yesterday afternoon. My motion is that for finding 5, we strike the word likely. So finding 5 will be amended to read as follows. The helicopter's landing was survivable. However, the Nyan Air provided harness tether system contributed to the passenger fatalities because it did not allow the passengers to quickly escape from the helicopter. There's my motion. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by the Vice Chairman. Discussion. So really what we're doing is taking the word likely out. We're trying to say it did. There's no doubt in my mind that a contraption like this that was rigged up by Fly Nyan impeded the ability of the passengers to escape and to live. I think staff does not necessarily agree with that, and I'd be glad to hear their thoughts. But before we go there, my colleagues have comments. Ms. Schultz, I'd love to hear your views.
Sure, thank you, Chairman.
The views of staff. Thank you.
Thank you. The investigation team is using the evidence that we have before us to draw these conclusions to ensure they're fully supported. In this accident, we know from onboard video that 2 passengers still had their FAA restraints fastened when the helicopter submerged. What we don't know is whether they became unbuckled after that we could not establish on their own, or if that was through the rescue workers, the rescue or escape personnel. We also know from the onboard video that 2 other passengers in the back did not have their FAA-approved restraints on. And from the evidence that we have, we think it's likely that 1 or more of those may have been impeded from egress due to the SPRS, but we can't say that definitively based on the evidence we have, so.
I do understand that, and I appreciate your views. And I do realize that the NTSB, if we're not 1,000% certain, no, if we're not absolutely certain, we do use the word likely. And I appreciate that.
And I would also note that we have identified the issue that we'll talk about in a bit in the probable cause or proposed. So we're absolutely, I think, in agreement with the board that that was a significant factor in this accident. But it's making sure that the facts lead us where our conclusions.
Thank you very much. Vice Chairman.
You know, I think and I also appreciate our commitment to, as the factual basis, but I think the operative term for me is contributed. And that modifies the fact that this may not have been the sole source of their inability to exit, but it did contribute, and I think we've had ample discussion this morning that made that very clear. In my aviation experience, I've never come across any kind of system that functioned or malfunctioned like this one would. So for that reason, I think the contributing factor of contributing makes this a better way to go.
Thank you. Any further comments from staff?
The only thing I would add in regard to the contribution is that I think we've identified in the draft report that there are many other factors that were likely involved, not the least of which is the cold shock from the water. So what we can't say is that if they had not been wearing the harnesses definitively, we cannot say that they still would have survived. They would have been able to egress. So that's why from a statement of contributing, we still have some concerns that we just don't have the evidence to take us there, but certainly respect the board's thoughts on that.
Thank you. Any further comments? Okay, it's been moved and seconded, no further discussion to amend the finding 5 as read and seconded. There's no further discussion. All in favor of adopting that amendment, please signal with a hand and say aye. All opposed, signal with a hand and say nay. And there are none. The finding number 5 has been amended unanimously. Before we take a motion to adopt the findings, now that they've been amended, I do have a question that I think we need to clarify. Clarify to the audience, clarify to me. So finding 6, we say the FAA, their approval process for the supplemental passenger restraint system that was implemented after the accident was inadequate because it did not provide adequate guidance to the inspectors to evaluate aircraft-specific installations, and then it goes on from there. What I'm concerned about is the appearance of moving the goalpost. We closed our urgent recommendation in June or July of that year because they did what we asked them to do. Are we in fact moving the goalpost? We said something was satisfactory, now we're not. So I think it's important that we air that, and so let's talk about that.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we closed that recommendation at the time based on what the FAA indicated they were going to do. What we have seen implemented is not consistent with what we believed they were going to do.
Okay. Well, thanks. And I voted for that to close it. I thought they acted, but usually we don't. We're very cautious about closing recs. We don't close until we've actually seen the proof in the pudding.
Right, and I'll ask Nate to respond as well if I get this incorrect, but I think with urgent recommendations, because of that classification, there's an expectation that it's going to be closed at a certain level of action. And so whereas, and I think that in that case, we closed it because that's what they said they were going to do. They issued literally an emergency order, which is what we asked for. But what they said they were going to do in implementing that order is what comes next in the course of,
Okay.
So.
Well, thanks. I just, I don't want to be accused of, we're accused of a lot of things, and I just want to make sure we're not moving the goalpost. I mean, we did close it acceptably, but I appreciate your answer there. Thank you. And Mr. Hoyt, I don't think we need an explanation.
I have nothing more to add.
Okay, thank you. So, do we have a motion to adopt the findings as amended? It's been moved by the Vice Chairman, seconded by Member Homendy. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the findings as amended, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are opposed. Please signal and say, I'm sorry. Tell you what, on the camera, when we take the vote, if you'd go to a wide shot, that way I can see how people are voting and without having to look around like this. So if you do that, that's what we usually do, so I can watch the vote. Okay, all in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye, and keep your hands up so I can look until we get the wide shot. Okay. Aye. Opposed? There are none. The motion to adopt the findings has been adopted unanimously. Thank you. Ms. Bryson, if you'd kindly read the proposed probable cause.
Staff proposes the following probable cause. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was Liberty Helicopter's use of a Nyan Air-provided passenger harness tether system, which caught and activated the floor-mounted engine fuel shutoff lever and resulted in the in-flight loss of engine power and the subsequent ditching. Contributing to this accident were, number one, Liberty's and Nyan Air's deficient safety management, which did not adequately mitigate foreseeable risks associated with the harness tether system, interfering with the floor-mounted controls and hindering passenger egress. Number 2, Liberty allowing Nion Air to influence the operational control of Liberty's Fly Nion flights. And number 3, the Federal Aviation Administration's inadequate oversight of Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 91, Revenue Passenger Carrying Operations. Contributing to the severity of the accident were number 1, Liberty and Nion Air's use of the harness tether system that hindered passenger egress, and number 2, the rapid capsizing of the helicopter due to partial inflation of the emergency flotation system.
Thank you very much. Are there any amendments? I have one, and I'd like to make a motion. My motion is that we amend the probable cause. I will not, at this point, for the sake of reading it, offering my motion, I will not read the entire thing. This is the exact same thing that was emailed out last evening. So what my motion is to amend the contributing to the severity of the accident clause. So really, we're just inverting the order. So here it is. My motion is to amend the probable cause where it says contributing to the severity of the accident were, number 1, the rapid capsizing of the helicopter due to partial inflation of the emergency flotation system, and number 2, Liberty and Nion's use of the harness/tether system that hindered passenger egress. There's the motion. Is there a second? Member Hamady has seconded. As far as discussion is concerned, I would propose that we make this amendment not necessarily to keep it in chronological order. Yes, it is chronological order. The rapid capsizing was due to the partial inflation of the emergency flotation system. Yes, it does keep this chronological, but my reasoning really is that if the floats inflated properly, the rotorcraft would not have inverted, and therefore the issue of the tether and harness would have been immaterial because the thing would not have turned over. So that is really the basis for why I would propose to is to reorder them. Discussion. Staff.
Thank you, Chairman. We don't have any technical concerns with that, but one item of note is with regard to the float in the helicopter turning over. There are a lot of factors that control how quickly that happens, and I think that's the long-term goal. I don't know, Cheech, if there's anything to be added there, but I think I just want to clarify that fundamentally we agree with you, and I think it's a
Thank you. Any other discussion? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. There's no further discussion on the probable cause amendment. And General Counsel, would you prefer that I read the entire thing from top to bottom? Okay. And I've already done that in my motion itself, so I think people understand the motion. And so it's been moved and seconded that we adopt the probable cause as amended. All in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. And so therefore, the probable cause has been adopted as amended. And Ms. Bryson, if you'd kindly read the proposed recommendation.
As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 15 new safety recommendations. To the Federal Aviation Administration, number 1, modify the Supplemental Passenger Restraint System, SPRS, approval process to, number 1, require letter of authorization, LOA, applicants to specify a need for and the intended use of an SPRS for each aircraft. Number 2, require the Federal Aviation Administration to evaluate and review for each specified aircraft all SPRS design, manufacture, installation, and operational conditions, including, at a minimum, the potential for passengers to become entangled during emergency egress, the adequacy of passenger emergency egress briefings, and the potential for the SPRS to interfere with aircraft controls. And number 3, ensure that each LOA lists the specific aircraft on which the holder is authorized to use the SPRS. Number 2, until you implement the Supplemental Passenger Restraint System, or SPRS, approval processes recommended in the Safety Recommendation Number 1 prohibit the use of SPRS for passenger carrying doors-off operations. Number 3, review the activation system designs of Federal Aviation Administration approved rotorcraft emergency flotation systems for deficiencies that may preclude their deployment, their proper deployment, such as a lack of a means to identify high pull forces on manual activation handles or inadequate guidance on the intended use of the activation system, and require corrective actions based on the review findings. Number 4, revise miscellaneous guidance 10 in advisory circular, or AC 27 and AC 29, to include design objectives for emergency flotation systems that consider human factors design objectives such as activation handle pull force characteristics, provisions for clear, unambiguous, and positive feedback to pilots to indicate that the float system was successfully deployed, and inspections to ensure that an installation of a manual activation system does not preclude a pilot's ability to deploy the floats as designed after it has been fielded. Number 5, require all commercial air tour operators, regardless of their operating rule, to implement a safety management system. Number 6, revise Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations 1.1, general definitions, to include definitions for the terms aerial work and aerial photography that specify only business-like, work-related aerial operations as originally intended. Number 7, revise Order 8900.1, Flight Standards Information Management System, to include guidance for inspectors who oversee Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Part 91 operations conducted under any of the 14 CFR 119.1E exceptions to identify potential hazards and ensure that operators are appropriately managing the associated risks. Number 8, after the actions requested in Safety Recommendation 10 are completed, require owners and operators of existing AS350 series helicopters to incorporate the changes. Number 9, develop guidance on how to identify intoxicated or impaired passengers and distribute it to operators who carry passengers for hire under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulation, Part 91 and Part 135. To Airbus, recommendation number 10, modify the floor-mounted fuel shutoff lever in AS350 series helicopters to protect it from inadvertent activation due to external forces or external influences. To the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, number 11, after the actions requested in Safety Recommendation 10 are completed, require owners and operators of existing AS350 series helicopters to incorporate the changes. To Liberty Helicopters, Inc., Recommendation 12, establish a safety management system. Number 13, train your employees to identify signs of impairment and intoxication in passengers and to deny those passengers boarding when appropriate. And to Nyon Air, number 14, establish a safety management system. And 15, train your employees to identify signs of impairment and intoxication in passengers and to deny those passengers boarding when appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we have several amendments for the recommendations. Vice Chairman, to clarify, you have no amendment, I believe, no proposed amendment. So I recognize Member Hamady.
Thank you. Yes, I have an amendment to recommendation 1 and 2. The amendment would strike recommendation 2, redesignate number 1 as number 2, and amend number 1, which is now number 2, as follows. For all other operators and pilots of doors-off flights.
Can I interrupt for just a moment? Since we're, okay, so one, what you're saying is add number 1. That's really,
Well, right now, it's 1 and 2. 1 deals with the SPRS. So I'm striking, if you look at the current recommendations.
Yep. Got it.
I'm striking 2 entirely.
Yep.
I'm moving 1 down to 2. I'm amending 1 as amended to 2, and then I'm putting in a new 1.
yes, and what I'm saying is since number 2, then your new number 2 becomes contingent upon number 1, let's do your new number 1 first. Does that make sense?
Read it first, you mean?
Let's vote on them separately.
They're contingent on each other.
Okay,
As
all
a
right,
package.
okay, all right, go ahead, I understand. Read number 1, your new number 1 first.
Number 1 would be prohibit the use of supplemental passenger restraint systems for passenger carrying doors off operations. And I would add for compensation or hire.
All right, and I think that, okay, I think we really ought to vote on these.
No,
And-
you can't, because the second one is contingent on the first one, because then the second one deals with all other operations.
Yeah, okay, we can do that, but if number 1 doesn't pass, then number 2 doesn't, then you don't need number 2, is that right?
That's correct.
All right, then let's vote on,
It would be together.
okay,
Because if number 1 doesn't pass, you wouldn't need number
That's-
2, but if number 1 passes and I offer it without number 2,
yeah, and that's what I'm saying, is that if number 1 does not pass, then we don't need number 2.
I would like to offer them both as one amendment.
Okay,
Thank you.
it's your amendment.
Number 1, prohibit the use of supplemental passenger restraint systems for passenger carrying doors off operations for compensation or hire. Number 2, for all other operators and pilots of doors off flights for compensation or hire, modify the SPRS approval process to 1, require letter of authorization or LOA applicants to specify a need for and the intended use of an SPRS for each aircraft. 2, require the Federal Aviation Administration to evaluate and review for each specified aircraft the need for the SPRS on that aircraft for all intended uses. All SPRS design, manufacture, installation, and operational considerations, including at a minimum the potential for passengers to become entangled during emergency egress, and the adequacy of passenger emergency egress briefings, and the potential for the SPRS to interfere with aircraft controls. And 3, ensure that each LOA lists that specific aircraft on which the holder is authorized to use an SPRS.
Okay, there's your motion, is there a second?
I'll second for the sake of discussion.
Okay, it's been seconded for the sake of discussion. Member Hamady, I recognize you.
Our current recommendation requires the FAA to approve their SPRS LOA process. And until it's improved, we're saying prohibit the use of the SPRS for passenger carrying doors off operations. The current executive order we have found is insufficient. And you've stated that the FAA did not carry it out as we intended. I don't think that I believe that their current review is not adequate from a 7-second video, and I know that you're intending something more than that. I don't have the faith that they will do that. I don't think that these supplemental restraint systems should be used in passenger carrying operations. And so that is the intent of my amendment, and happy to have that discussion.
Thanks. I just want to clarify what you added. Let's see, in addition to what you provided for number 1, at the end of it, you're saying adding what for commercial operations? Is that what
For
you're?
compensation or higher.
Okay, for compensation, all right, let me write. All right,
Okay, so put this in plain English. Don't read the whole thing, just tell me what your desired outcome is.
That for passenger operations like Fly Nyon,
For commercial operations,
that they would not use these supplemental passenger restraint systems.
at all, or unless they're approved?
Prohibited from using them. And that everybody else outside of the passenger carrying operations would go through the LOA process.
Including restricted to commercial operations, or is that everybody?
Well, right now,
Because-
the LOA applies to everybody for compensation or higher.
Right. Where I'm trying to understand here is there are a lot of professional photography operations and so forth that are out there that are truly under the guise of aerial work and so on. And so and we have had no problems with them for decades. So
Right.
I would be concerned if we had a requirement that says no matter what you do, you can't have a supplemental restraint system because by definition, they are passengers, they're not crew members.
Well, are they by definition passengers?
I'd ask Captain Lawrence to comment, but I believe in that aerial photography example, they would likely be considered crew members if they're part of, but Dave?
There's no definition in the FARs about, or the regulations, what a passenger is. There's no legal definition of a passenger. Typically in work-related operations, they define these, the certificate operator defines them as essential personnel to the operation of the flight. And those are the ones that are typically for work-related operations.
So I'm just thinking here of aerial photography, air-to-air, that kind of thing, where you take the doors off an aircraft or a helicopter, and that seems like it would, it's essential that you have a supplemental restraint system. And that has been operating, again, for decades without any major problems. So I want to be careful that we don't overreach here in putting in a requirement that somebody could misconstrue as this person is a passenger, therefore they have to go through all of this. So I would agree with your for compensation and higher as it fits under what we're discussing here. I would have some difficulty if we went broader than that, because then it starts to interfere with some other operations that are being run in a far more responsible manner than what we've seen here, with people who are trained and know what they're doing.
Well, I agree with you on those other operations, which is why I've amended the SPRS approval process for everyone else who's not passenger carrying operations. And if we have to include non-essential personnel as passenger carrying operations, then we can do that.
so I asked the question, why for a doors-off operation do we have supplemental passenger restraints? It's to keep people from falling
out of
out.
the airplane.
Do they have FAA restraints? Does anybody else use these
Yes.
outside of them?
Yes, and I think to the chairman's question, I mean, again, in aerial photography,
I'm not talking
All
aerial
right, all right,
photography,
we're gonna-
I'm talking
let-
passenger
let-
operations.
Okay, one at a time.
Yep.
And run it,
Okay.
I'll recognize each of you, so.
okay, so I'm not understanding here, I think, what you're getting to. So I'm going to shut up and go into listen mode here, and let's try this again.
Fly Nyon. Passengers for hire operations.
No question.
Not aerial photography, surveying pipelines, crop dusting.
Air-to-air types
That's
of things.
different.
Okay, good, got it.
No, I don't intend to support it. I think that the passenger restraints are for a reason, and as I said earlier, with Jim Reason's work, for every management decision, there's a potential downside. And I want to make sure, I don't mind supplemental passenger restraints as long as those risks are properly managed. And that's what our recommendation is basically calling for, is to properly manage those risks If they're done right, I don't want somebody falling out of a helicopter, nor do I want somebody drowning. Whatever was done in New York was wrong. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done properly. Further discussion.
Yes, so then I would be prepared to remove the words, "the use of supplemental passenger restraint systems for these passenger carrying operations," and say that passenger carrying doors operations should be prohibited entirely. That's the safest. I'm not talking about for aerial photography, I'm talking about passenger carrying operations. So if you're saying a supplemental restraint is needed because these doors are off and people are going to fall out of helicopters, then they shouldn't be flying passengers with the doors off of a helicopter.
Well, there's some helicopters that don't even have doors.
And there are lots of helicopters that do. Those that don't then shouldn't carry passengers.
I guess I'm wondering if, again, fortunately, this is a one-off situation that we have. There's not a broad basis here, and I'm absolutely, I think we're all in a complete agreement about what happened here was beyond the pale. But I'm a little hesitant to say we broadly prohibited supplemental restraints on this just across the board. That I'm uneasy with that.
Staff, would you like to weigh in on this?
Thank you, Chairman. I would say that staff has not done an exhaustive look at all the different types of operations that might involve doors off. But I think, Chairman, you put it well. We do agree that the current approval process for SPRS is not, it's broken. It needs to be enhanced. It needs to be a much higher standard to get these things used, whether we're talking about paying passengers or crew members. Everyone needs to have that assurance that these SPRSs are going to work correctly. They're going to be considered as an installed system. So all the aspects of potential entanglement are considered, and as you said, Chairman, that the risks, the hazards are appropriately mitigated and manage the risk. So that's what we want. It's a much higher standard than what they put out through this letter of authorization. And we believe that standard should apply for anybody who's going to wear that thing in the air.
Thank you very much. Member Hamady.
I'm afraid to ask a question because you might hit me with the gavel.
Well, you
there.
never know.
I do have a question. Do you think it is clear in the current recommendation that the FAA should review the need for having the SPRS at all for all intended uses?
That staff, I think, would support that there be an evaluation of the need for it and clarification on operationally exactly how it's going to be used, specific to the aircraft. So again, we want this to be looked at as a system installed, or I shouldn't say installed, but a system that's used as part of the aircraft system. So yes, we would believe that would be going in the right direction.
Okay. So with that, I'm prepared to withdraw my amendment, then offer another amendment in its place.
Okay, the Vice Chairman, you seconded her amendment. Are you okay with her withdrawing? Okay.
I am.
I don't even know if that requires a second, but I want, yeah, well, you know. Okay, please, I'd love to hear your.
Then I have an amendment to recommendation number 1. So I will, if you look at recommendation 1, not my, got it. Okay, recommendation number 1, modify the supplemental passenger restraint system SPRS approval process to 1, require letter of authorization or LOA applicants to specify a need for and the intended use of an SPRS for each aircraft, and 2, require the Federal Aviation Administration to evaluate and review for each specified aircraft the need for the SPRS on that aircraft for all intended uses. And then it picks up again. The rest would remain the same in the current recommendation. So what we're adding there is the need for the SPRS on that aircraft for all intended uses.
If you could give us just a second, please.
Yeah, but we don't have a second on that quite yet, but yeah, you'll go ahead and start working on that. And
Yeah.
so that's your motion. Is there a second? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. We will sit here for a few minutes while staff hashes that out. Thank you. Ms. Bryson.
Thank you, sir, for the pause. I just wanted to make sure that staff had had the opportunity, and I understand that they have previously seen this language and are comfortable with it being inserted as recommended.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And so what we're adding here is the verbiage. It says the need for the SPRS on that aircraft for all intended uses. Okay? Does everyone understand what the motion is? We've moved and seconded. Yes, please, General Counsel.
I was just saying, for confirmation, we are talking about amending number 1.
That
Not-
is correct.
not number-
And I
thank
tell you what, just to make darn sure, I hate to ask you to read the whole thing in its entirety, but go ahead and do that. We've got it, it's been moved and seconded. Here's the verbiage, and then we'll vote on it.
Modify the Supplemental Passenger Restraint System, SPRS, approval process to 1, require letter of authorization, LOA applicants, to specify a need for and the intended use of an SPRS for each aircraft. 2, require the Federal Aviation Administration to evaluate and review for each specified aircraft the need for the SPRS on that aircraft for all intended uses. All SPRS design, manufacture, installation, and operational considerations, including at a minimum, the potential for passengers to become entangled during emergency egress, the adequacy of passenger emergency egress briefings, and the potential for the SPRS to interfere with aircraft controls. And 3, ensure that each LOA lists the specific aircraft on which the holder is authorized to use an SPRS.
Thank you very much. It's been moved, it's been seconded. No further discussion? Is that a fair assumption? No further discussion. All in favor of adopting that amendment, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The amendment has been passed unanimously. Are there any further amendments to the recommendations?
I have an amendment.
Okay, thank you.
My amendment is to add a new recommendation to the Federal Aviation Administration, And it was a recommendation that we issued in 1995 as a special investigative report. And then we included it in an additional, well, I'll get to that. The new recommendation is develop and implement national standards within 14 CFR Part 135 or equivalent regulations for all air tour operations with powered airplanes and rotorcraft to bring them under one set of standards with operations specifications and eliminate the exception currently contained in 14 CFR Part 135.1.
Thank you for your motion. Is there a second?
Second for discussion.
Seconded for discussion, so please.
This was verbatim the recommendation we previously issued, and we were in discussion with the FAA and pushing them to implement through 2012. We ended up closing that unacceptable and have, in the interim, investigated a number of accidents and are currently in the process of investigating a number of accidents where they're operating air tours under Part 91, and they should be under the stronger Part 135. In this particular accident, they were operating under an egregious interpretation of current regulations. That there's no doubt about that. That was in our findings. However, they are now NION is operating under Part 91 with 136 and an LOA, which is exactly what the NTSB opposed in 2012 when we closed this recommendation unacceptable. So I don't want to have to come back and say, well, we weren't happy with really how they were operating under these sets of rules, and oops, they had an accident, and now we have to recommend stronger regulation. We have been consistently on record as one set of safety standards for passenger carrying operations, and in particular, air tours. So that's why I'm offering that.
For passenger, for safety, for compensation or higher, yes.
This says air tour operations.
No, I was just commenting that yeah, never mind. Vice Chairman.
I'm going to show some ignorance here and maybe ask Captain Lawrence. Are these, on 135 passenger carrying, are they scaled relative to the type of operation so that, somebody who's operating a single engine 4-place airplane, for example, versus somebody who's operating turbine equipment?
Your equipment requirements are listed in 135. I don't have them on the top of my head right now, but there are equipment and seat passenger restrictions.
But they are scalable. In
Yes.
other words, so when we say one size fits all, that isn't quite correct. I mean, because in some cases it wouldn't be possible.
Right. When you get to a certain level of number of seats and such, you may be moving up to a 121 requirement or equipment requirement.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm understanding here where we're going.
Well, the fact is that many, and I support the amendment, by the way, the fact is most air tour operators are probably operating under Part 135 anyway. Is that correct? I mean, we haven't surveyed the entire community, but I know that we've seen accidents with air tour operators, and they were operated under Part 135. So I have the feeling that many of them are. So why would they not? Why would we not want people operating to that higher level? I know that sounds contradictory to say we've investigated accidents with those, but they were due to various reasons. I think that I agree with Member Hamady that once you hang out a shingle and charge money and exchange money for goods and services, there needs to be a higher standard of care. I mean, from a legal perspective, there is a higher standard of care. But why is the FAA not requiring that higher standard of care? This is a trap here. it's a loophole that we've pointed out that Nyon Air was operating under, clearly trying to not have the greater FAA oversight. That's why they were so cautious about avoiding terms like air tours and routes and things like that. And I think we need to take the hard line and say that, by George, if you're going to charge people to go up for an air tour, it will be conducted under Part 135. But how do we deal with this aerial exception situation again? How do we prevent that? Because they would still have that ability. Would they not?
Mr. Lawrence?
Yeah, if the board adopts the recommendations that stand right now as far as defining what aerial photography is to make sure that is business and work related, the exception would only apply to those business type of operations, aerial photography, legitimate operations like commercial and SAG work, and it would not include the passenger carrying that I think is what your amendment is targeting.
Any further discussion? Okay, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the new recommendation as presented. All in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye. Carl, I'm watching you. All opposed, signal with a hand and say nay. There are none. The new recommendation has been adopted unanimously. Are there any further amendments to any further recommendations? Okay, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the recommendations as revised. It's been moved by Vice Chairman, seconded by Member Hamady. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the recommendations as amended, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The findings as amended have been adopted. The recommendations as amended have been adopted unanimously. Does anyone, are there any additional comments or issues for discussion as it relates to this particular report? There are none. Is there a motion to adopt the report as revised? Vice Chairman and seconded by Member Hamady. It's been moved and seconded to adopt the report as amended. All in favor, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The report has been adopted unanimously.
May I just add a comment, Mr. Chairman? For the report, we've now added a recommendation, so staff will update the report for the information that is necessary for that recommendation.
And I appreciate that. And would it be the sense of the board that you would like to see that language circulated?
That would be good, probably.
Okay, I tell you what we would like to do, we're adopting the report today, and what I'd like to do is, I think the sense of the board is that we'd like to see the additional language circulated for approval. Don't feel strongly about that?
Yes, that'd be good.
Okay, all right.
The other option is that staff can make the enhancements, the additions to support the recommendations, and adopt as presented. So, right, we have.
Sorry, I wasn't understanding your question. I was in the same thought process as Dana. That's what I thought that we were doing, is that you have, so are you reserving your vote on the report, or are you?
No, we're not reserving the vote. We're voting on the final report today. But Dana, I didn't hear what you said. Ms. Bryson.
Chairman, I think we need to circulate the report once the changes are made. There'll need to be additions to the report to support finding that then supports the recommendation. So it's not a pencil change in the report. So I think it's going to need to be circulated to the board just for one final look.
Okay,
Yeah, and I would ask GC to clarify that that is,
Right, so it's appropriate, you may, again, the changes are supporting what you have voted for the amendments. So you may vote on the report in anticipation of those changes being made with your then review and obviously the editing process of those changes. So you
Okay.
may vote understanding that those changes are still going to be coming your way.
and we will vote on those changes. Is that correct?
Not usually.
Okay,
It's a coordination item then in PMA.
okay. All right. So we are going to take a motion to adopt the findings, to adopt the report as presented, as revised, and then staff will circulate the page changes for review. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Do I have a motion to do exactly that? Member Hamady has moved, and Vice Chairman has seconded. All in favor of adopting the report as revised, subject to, and staff will circulate the page changes. All in favor of adopting that, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. The report has been adopted unanimously. Do any members wish to reserve the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Member Hamady does. Thank you very much. So in closing, thank you to my colleagues for your work going into the board meeting, your preparation, the good discussion, the good debate. And Todd Gunther, thank you for serving as investigator in charge on this. I always say nothing gets done around here without a team, and so special thanks to the program and the support staffs who make all of this possible. The investigative team, though, thank you. It's really good work, and I think that we're going to make a difference with this report. The recommendations that we issued today, if acted upon, will result in a ban on the supplemental restraint systems until the FAA can apply appropriate scrutiny and oversight to such systems. They will result in emergency flotation systems designed with human factors in mind, such that the pull force necessary to properly inflate them and the feedback the pilot receives when the floats are properly inflated. If acted upon, today's recommendations will result in definitions of aerial work and aerial photography to close the loophole and in safety management systems for all air tour operators. There's nothing like the experience of an air tour to see the location from a different perspective. But it is madness to allow the thrill of such an experience to be spiked with unnecessary risk to passengers, to crew, and to innocent bystanders. We stand adjourned.